Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and I have been so excited to film this fall book haul. You have no idea. I went to some really lovely book sales with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. No, we still have not filmed any of our get-togethers, and it is something that we both think about and then never actually get around to. But Marissa did finally take this photo of us, so I'm including it here to prove that yes, indeed, we have been in the same space at the same time, many times over the past 3 years. These will probably not be in the order that I have listed them down below, but I do always try to list all the books that I mention in case you would like to explore any of them further yourself. I'm going to start with the 4 books that I did not buy at library book sales, the books that I bought through indie booksellers of some sort. The first being 2 books that I purchased in August when I went into New York City to see Once Upon a Mattress. The first of them being The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho by Patterson Joseph. I have heard so many fabulous things about this book for so long that I could not wait any further, especially when I saw that it was actually available at McNally Jackson. Plus, I was extra pleased to see that I do in fact know Patterson Joseph. I had no idea until I opened the back flap and saw a picture of him and went, oh my gosh, no, I've seen you in stuff. I've seen you in shows. I had no idea that he was an actor that I have seen in Doctor Who and many other shows over the years. So I'm now extra excited to see what his writing is like. I believe I've mentioned this book a number of times now, but this is the story of Charles Ignatius Sancho, who was a real Black figure in British history at the end of the 18th century, and I believe he was the first Black man given the right to vote in Britain. So I'm really intrigued to explore his story. Also, I believe this year it's some anniversary of James Baldwin, and I did read Giovanni's Room a few years ago at my cousin's behest, and I really didn't like it. But I have been feeling called to try If Beale Street Could Talk. I think this plotline is going to be much more appealing. I'm hoping that he treats the characters a lot better in this as well. My main problem with Giovanni's Room is that the main character just seemed to hate himself so much that it made me really uncomfortable. So I'm hoping that in this book the characters treat themselves better than that, at least. I believe this is the story of a very young, possibly teenage couple, and the girl becomes pregnant, but her boyfriend is then arrested, I believe falsely. And it's the story of them, their families, and all of them trying to figure out what are we going to do now. I also ordered for the whole family A Death in Diamonds by S.J. Bennett, which is the next book in the Her Majesty Investigates series. I've talked about that series on this channel before and how much I adore it, and my parents love reading them too. And I was surprised that I hadn't heard that there was a new one coming out. I discovered 2 things. Number 1, this does not continue forward in time with Her Majesty, but it instead goes backwards to, I believe, the start of her reign. And we see how she got started trying to solve mysteries surreptitiously. So while I'm excited to see that, I will miss having Rosie as her PA. I forget what her job title is, but I will miss having Rosie as a character. In addition, the second thing I discovered is that this book, and indeed the 5th book, which I think is coming out in February, are not being published here in the US. They are UK only. I don't know why that should be, but I had to order this book then because there is no other way for us to get our hands on it. Which I justified the fact that by purchasing this one book, at least 3 people are going to read it, so that's a help. And lastly, as I think I've mentioned, I've had a rough month or so at school recently. And I discovered that a rather fluffy looking book that I've had my eye on for years was on sale for about $6 on Blackwell's. So I had to treat myself. And that book is Looking for Captain Poldark by Rowan Coleman. I hope I remembered their name correctly. This is a book about a woman who loves Poldark, at least loves the show. Not sure about the books as well, but in any case, she, I believe, goes with a tour group to tour Cornwall, and they're hoping to maybe stumble across the filming of the new season while they're there. And of course, she may or may not find romance for herself along the way. It sounds delightful, and it's been years since I talked about my love for Poldark on this channel, so I'm hoping this will reignite it a bit. I could always reread the books, but I have so many other books that I also want to read. Then we get to book sale books. First, at the end of August, Marissa and I went to a book sale near my home, which did not have as good a selection as they have had in the past, but we still had a lovely time. The first book that I picked up there was The Black Arrow by Robert Louis Stevenson. I remember loving the Wishbone episode of this way back when, but I've never actually read the book. I remember it feeling very much like a combination of Robin Hood and Ivanhoe, and I love those type of stories as well. So I'm intrigued to see what this one is actually like, especially now that I know more of the historical context that it's set in. I don't remember off the top of my head exactly when that is, but I know I understand much more about it now than I did when I was, say, 7. I also picked up The Time Garden by Edward Eager, which I am so excited about. You may remember I reread Half Magic in April or May, and it reignited my love for that series and reminded me that I really don't remember reading book 2, and I certainly never read books 3 or 4. I believe this is book 4, so we have more time-traveling children with hilarious consequences. I'm very excited for it. I also found this edition of Los Empeños de una Casa by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who I have been fascinated by since I learned about her in university. Sor Juana was a nun in the 15 or 1600s in Mexico, I believe, who was also an incredible poet. And so I've been meaning to read more of her work and find out more about her, but I never actually have. So I'm hoping this will give me the spur to finally do that. Although now that I'm reading the back, it may not be a poetry collection. It says here that it's a play? Possibly a profane play? My Spanish speakers, I'm going to read you the back and tell me if I'm missing anything. Las frecuentes alusiones de carácter amatorio y los devaneos amorosos de Doña Leonor, joven, coqueta, hermosa, culta y discreta, forman la trama de Los Empeños de una Casa, singular obra de teatro profano de Juana de Asbaje y Ramírez de Santillana, mejor conocida como Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Is it in fact a dirty play? Am I reading that right? I think I am. Makes me even more intrigued, frankly. Then I also picked up the delightfully cozy looking Toast and Marmalade by Emma Bridgewater, which is her memoirs. Emma Bridgewater is famous for creating a pottery line. You may recognize these types of mugs. And these, I believe, are her memoirs about her family life and also, I believe, starting her business. Speaking of Spanish, I also found a copy of The Basque History of the World by Mark Kurlansky, who I know is very well thought of in the nonfiction community, but I haven't read any of his work yet. The Basque Country, if you're unfamiliar, is a tiny region of Spain towards the north. It's right up against the border with France. And it has had a famously fraught relationship with being part of Spain. including terrorist action really quite recently through the 70s into the early 2000s, trying to become independent once again. I learned a little bit about them in a lot of my Spanish history and culture classes, but I'm intrigued to see what else this has to say because clearly it's quite a bit. I also finally found a copy of The Princess de Cleves by Madame de Lafayette. And for years, especially based on this portrait on the cover, I thought this was a French novel about Anne of Cleves. I got it home to discover that it in fact has nothing to do with Anne of Cleves. It's just a major French novel. One of the first, I think, since it says it first appeared in 1678. So we shall see. I also found Family History by Vida Sackville-West, and I loved reading... Hold on, I need to look at the title. I can't read the title from over here, but I loved reading one of Vida Sackville-West's books, and I will insert the title here. So I'm really intrigued to read more by her as well, now that I know that I loved one novel and I got on with her writing much better than I do with Virginia Woolf's. I am excited to read more, and that is really all I know about this one, and I kind of want to keep it that way. I also found some interesting larger books that I did not link down below, but I thought I'd share with you anyway. I'm always on the lookout for opera scores when I go to library book sales because they are so much more affordable there. So I picked up a copy of Otell by Giuseppe Verdi, which I've never actually heard all the way through, though of course I know the plot since I have read Shakespeare's Othello. And I also picked up, I believe this is the Italian version of Don Carlo by Giuseppe Verdi again. I saw the French language version of this a year or two ago at the Met and adored it. So not quite the same since the lyrics are in a different language, but I believe musically it is exactly the same. They also had some books of fashion plates, which I found very exciting. The first was Ackerman's Costume Plates, which showcases English fashion from 1818 to 1828, which is a fascinating period in history. The changes that happen are really quite odd, but also quite fun. And then Paris fashions of the 1890s. So we really get the whole range of the 19th century between the two of these. Then a few weeks later, we went to two book sales that were close to Marissa, and those were fantastic in terms of my finds. First of all, I did find two picture books there, as long as we're on oversized books. I picked up this copy of The 12 Dancing Princesses, first of all, which has been retold by Mariana Meyer. But I mainly picked it up for the illustrations. These were illustrated by K.Y. Craft. And I remember reading this as a child in various libraries and loving the illustrations and how detailed and gorgeous they were. And the way they captured light were just stunning. That one I remember being one of my absolute favorites. All the princesses walking through the woods. Gorgeous. So I was so pleased to find a copy of this. Then one that I haven't read yet, but that is deeply intriguing. The Story of Neps and Tatty by Amy Johnson and Diane Madden. This looks adorable. This is the story of two tortoises who I believe live in Scotland, and just the story of their life from wandering about the garden to hibernating in the refrigerator. It just sounds delightful and cute and gorgeous. Now on to the adult books that I found, and there were tons. First of all, I've always wanted to try Balzac in order to become more like Marion the Librarian from The Music Man, so I found a rather small Balzac novel and thought I would give that a go first, and that was Pergorio. I really don't know anything about this. I'm presuming that Pergorio is a priest of some sort, and I know Honoré de Balzac wrote I believe he was part of the realism or modernism movement that happened in the mid-19th century in Europe, and that he's very highly thought of, especially in France. Almost Dickensian, I think, so I'm intrigued to see where this goes. I also found A Life of My Own by Claire Tomalin, which are her memoirs. Claire Tomalin is, of course, a very famous biographer, mainly literary biographer. Her biography of Jane Austen is one of the standards of Austen biographies. She has also written biographies of Dickens, Samuel Pepys, and Thomas Hardy, so I'm really fascinated to see what her memoirs of her own life are like. I also heard fantastic things about The Mermaid of Black conch? I've always said conch. By Monique Roffey when it was nominated for the Costa Book Award in 2020, and so I'm really pleased to have found a copy for myself. I always thought this was more historical, still set in the Caribbean, still looking at mermaids, possibly magically real, possibly not. But no, in fact, I think it's a lot more modern than I thought it was, but I'm still intrigued to see, especially since Bernardine Evaristo has given it her seal of approval. Okay, in looking at the back, it is definitely magically real, but also set in the 1970s, about a mermaid falling for a fisherman. I believe there must be underlying symbolism of racism, colonialism, those sorts of themes. It sounds fascinating. I also found this book, The Short Life and Long Times of Mrs. Beaton by Catherine Hughes. And this book basically explores not only Mrs. Beaton's life, but how she was able to write a cookbook that became a household staple for over a century on about 6 months' experience being a housewife. I watched a film about Mrs. Beaton many years ago, mainly because J.J. Field happened to be in it, but I'm really intrigued to get a more factual approach to who she was and how she accomplished the writing of one of the most famous English cookbooks. I also found a copy of We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal, which is a young adult fantasy novel, I believe, that is very much Arab-inspired. The author herself being, I believe, Niqabi? I have been fascinated by this since my friend Jonathan picked up a copy at BookCon in 2019, but I've never actually read it myself. When we talked about it, he actually said he had mixed feelings about it, as he felt like it had been a bit too heavily inspired by one of the Assassin's Creed storylines. I have no experience with Assassin's Creed, however, so I'm intrigued to see what this is like. I also found a copy of Dracula by Bram Stoker and finally decided, you know what? Fine, I will actually read it. I don't think it's nearly as gory or scary as I think it's going to be, and everyone else seems to be reading it for this Victober. I won't be reading it for Victober, but I will be reading it at some point. I don't need to tell you what this one is about, is it? Everyone knows Dracula at this point. I also found this translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, as well as Pearl and Sir Orfeo, as written by Tolkien. I think I was vaguely aware that he had written a translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but I never expected to find a copy for so cheap. And I've never actually read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and what better translator or author to read it from than Tolkien? At Marissa's behest, I also picked up The Odd Women by George Gissing, which I know she absolutely adored when she read it. This is a Victorian novel looking at single women, women who are left over, like an odd sock. I also have Gissing's new Grub Street from a book sale this summer, so the universe is clearly telling me to read more Gissing, to read any Gissing, in fact. I also found Baracon by Zora Neale Hurston. This sounds fascinating. This is Zora Neale Hurston's story of interviewing a man who was on the last slave ship I believe, that entered the US, or possibly ever. Oh, it was definitely ever. That last slave ship was illegally brought to the US, and he was enslaved 50 years after we had abolished it. That's incredible. And what I really want to do is pair this, possibly, of reading Olaudah Equiano's memoirs, which I believe were some of the first recorded stories of what being a slave on a slave ship was like. So I think it'd be really fascinating to get the beginning and also the end between those two books. I also found this copy of Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransome, which I have heard about for so long. This is a staple of British children's fiction, but it's really hard to find here in the US, so I'm so pleased I have a copy. I have always pictured this as kind of like the Boxcar Children, but British and involving boats rather than rail. I also picture this as being much better done. I never really liked the Boxcar Children, but these sound adorable and sweet, and so I might save them for the summer and then watch the television series. Then I found Scenes of Clerical Life by George Eliot. No, I have not read any George Eliot yet, because I am not only intimidated by her writing style, but also the size of the novels. So, since this one is quite a moderate size, I might start with this one to get used to her style, then attempt either Middlemarch or Daniel Deronda. I also found Swan Song by Kelly Greenberg Jeffcott, which has been on my list since 2018 or 2019 as well. This is the story of, I believe, 5 women that Truman Capote knew and called his swans, and all of the drama and infighting that went on between them. I'm not a huge fan of Truman Capote as a writer, but this always sounded really fascinating, and I think they just made this into a television series as well recently. I also found a copy of Holox, which is the latest in the Nevermore series by Jessica Townsend. I thought the 4th book was supposed to come out this month, but Marissa was saying that it's been pushed back and pushed back, so we don't know when we're going to get the final book, but I loved the first 2 books, and I'm now really pleased to have the next book, so I can now choose to listen to it or physically read it. I also found this copy of The Time Traveler's Guide to Elizabethan England by Ian Mortimer. I've never read any of Ian Mortimer's books yet. I've heard really, really great things about them. I've heard that some people don't find these terribly accurate, so I'm intrigued to see where I fall when I finally read this. But he writes nonfiction about life in a variety of time periods, this one being Elizabethan England, which is one of my favorite areas. And it looks hardly touched as well, which is extra fun. I also yielded and got this copy of Henrik Ibsen's 4 Major Plays, which is a bind-up of A Doll's House, Ghosts, Hedda Gabler, and The Master Builder. My mother has always talked about Ibsen's plays, and I know the basic plot of A Doll's House, but I've never actually seen or read any of them, so I decided to finally bite the bullet and pick this up. Scoop also followed me around between both of those book sales, so I finally yielded and picked up a copy, and this is the novel by Evelyn W. When I see this title, I think of the Woody Allen film with Scarlett Johansson, which was my first Woody Allen film that I ever saw when I was about 13, and it made a big impression. This has nothing to do with that movie, however, I believe. This is Evelyn Waugh's satire of journalism, I believe, at the beginning of the 20th century, which sounds like it could be fun. I hated A Handful of Dust when I had to read that for school. I haven't read Brideshead Revisited, but that one has intrigued me more, so I'm hoping I get on with this one. Marissa also convinced me to pick up Precious Bane by Mary Webb, as it's a novel that she really loved. One of the women checking us out also really loved it. It's a novel of the Napoleonic era, the Regency era in Shropshire that was published in the 1920s. And I believe our heroine also has a cleft palate or a hair lip, and all the drama that goes along with living with that form of disability. And also romantic drama in their lives. It sounds intriguing. Also, the library had bookmarks that gave you coupons for Medici TV, so I took one of them as well. I also picked up this tiny novella of The Governesses by Anne Serre. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. This is a French novel that sounds very gothic and very dark, and I believe it's set in the Victorian era. I'm not even sure, the back doesn't even say, because it's so tiny they don't dare give anything away. I also collect religious texts, and I've got quite a variety reflecting the world's religions. I haven't read all of them yet, but I plan to one day. So to that end, I picked up this copy of the Bhagavad Gita that Penguin put out, which is one of the fundamental texts of Hinduism. And I also found this lovely Haggadah. I have been to a Passover Seder, but not since I was about 5 years old, and I don't remember very much of it. But what I love about it is that it has the original Hebrew, it has a translation, and it also has little explanations of when you would need to use these, why we do certain things. I think it's a really well put together Haggadah, especially for older children. So I hope to read through this as well. I also found the highly recommended Parallel Lives by Phyllis Rose, which is nonfiction, I believe, looking at the development of 5 Victorian marriages. I also found this delightful copy of 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. I did read that in June of last year. At least I listened to the audiobook that was narrated by Hugh Laurie. So I thought between that and the cover, I really ought to pick this up. I also found Once Upon an Eid, which are stories of hope and joy by 15 Muslim authors. And looking at the list on the back, I do know a couple. I've heard good things about S.K. Ali, and I love G. Willow Wilson as an author. And I'm excited to discover 13 new voices as well. So these are, as you may have guessed, 15 short stories, all centering around the celebration of Eid al-Fitr, which celebrates the end of Ramadan. I also found the intriguing Fanny by Edmund White, which is a story of 2 Fannys, so I'm not sure which one the titular Fanny is meant to be, but it's his novel of Fanny Trollope, Anthony Trollope's mother, and another woman also named Fanny that she knew who led a fairly disreputable life, certainly unconventional. So that sounded interesting. And then finally, I was thrilled to find a copy of The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher by Kate Summerscale, which is nonfiction about a really famous murder case in the Victorian era that was incredibly influential. Everyone was following this case in the newspapers. I read a little bit about this case in Lucy Worsley's book, A Very British Murder, I believe, and I loved Mrs. Robinson's Disgrace by Kate Summerscale, which I read many, many years ago. It's one of my favorite nonfiction books about a really famous Victorian divorce case. So I'm really intrigued to see what she does with this murder case as well. I also forgot I picked up 4 books from school. So at the beginning of the year, a lot of teachers were cleaning out their bookcases, and there was a big announcement of come down, take anything you would like to take. Anything else is going to be donated. And I found 4 really interesting books. The first proves exactly how much of a nerd I am. And it's this textbook of Right Source 2000. This is a grammar textbook that was brand new when I was in 4th or 5th grade. Well, a year or 2 old, but still. And it's exactly that. It's a writer's guide, and so how to write various forms of writing, how stories develop, there are grammar exercises. I found this endlessly fascinating as a child. Is it any wonder I grew up to be an English major and a teacher? So when someone was giving away their last copy of this textbook, I had to save it. I also found this copy, which I remember being on a lot of my teacher's bookshelves growing up, but that I can't remember actually reading myself. And that is At Her Majesty's Request, An African Princess in Victorian England by Walter Dean Myers. Walter Dean Myers is a highly respected children's author, and I can't believe I never picked this up, as it has everything that I look for in a novel. It is set in a historical period. It's in Victorian England, of course, and it's a true story. It's about Sarah Forbes Bonetta, who was an African princess whose parents were killed, and so she is taken by a British naval officer to Victorian England and apparently met Queen Victoria. I think that would be fascinating. I also saved 2 Dear America books that they were giving away that I also don't remember actually ever reading. I may have, but they clearly slipped my memory if I did. The Winter of Red Snow, which follows a girl in the Revolutionary War, specifically living near Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and then A Time for Courage, which follows the suffragette movement through the eyes of a girl living in DC in 1917. So those were all of the books that I picked up this autumn. I probably won't do another book haul until after Christmas, so it will be sometime in January. There will, of course, be books coming in as my birthday and Christmas are coming up, but I will be trying not to buy any more books until that point. Let me know down below if you loved any of these books and if I should move them further up my reading priority list. Also, if you're at a loss for words, leave me an emoji that you think, or a series of emojis that you think best represents one of the books that I mentioned, and I will try and guess which one it was. I've seen loads of people doing that as a trend, so I thought, why not? I'll give it a try. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye, everyone.